Warhammer 40k Space Marine was a true hidden gem of the PS3 360 generation. Despite having some rough edges, Space Marine stood out in a sea of shooters that generation thanks to its unique blend of Gears of War-esque third-person over-the-shoulder shooting and weighty hack-and-slash combat, which also made it one of the stronger licensed games of its time. Now, almost 13 years later, we finally have a follow-up to the much-loved classic in the form of Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, though this time it's coming from a different developer. Unlike the first Space Marine, which was developed by Relic Entertainment, Space Marine 2 was made by Saber Interactive, the studio responsible for 2019's World War Z, as well as the upcoming Turok Origins, which was announced at the Game Awards. With this sequel arriving over a decade after the prior Space Marine, and a new studio taking the helm, I certainly had a degree of skepticism going into Space Marine 2. However, I'm happy to report that within a couple of hours of play, any concerns had faded away, as Space Marine 2 turned out to be everything I could have hoped for out of a Space Marine sequel. Space Marine 2 takes the lessons learned from the first Space Marine game to make a tighter, more refined version of what came before it, while also borrowing the best aspects of Saber's prior games, making masterful use of the swarm system from World War Z. All these improvements make Space Marine 2 a sequel that outshines its predecessor in every conceivable way. Before we get further into this review, there is one thing I should clarify first and foremost. I'm not a Warhammer fan. I know next to nothing about this universe, I've never played the tabletop game, and I have little to no interest in tabletop gaming in general. With that being said, even I enjoyed the original Space Marine, which clearly says something about the quality of that game. So while my experience with the first Space Marine did have me excited for Space Marine 2, do keep in mind that this is a review from the perspective of a layman to the Warhammer universe. So if you're looking for the thoughts of someone who knows Warhammer and its lore intimately, this probably won't be the review for you, as I'll be the first to admit that there were elements of Space Marine 2's story that went right over my head, and I'm sure I don't grasp the full lore ramifications of this game. But if you're in the same position as me, maybe I can tell you why Space Marine 2 might still be worth your time, even if you're an outsider to this universe. Space Marine 2 comes packing 3 separate modes. The campaign, where you'll make your way through a roughly 10-hour long story. Operations, a series of standalone co-op missions you're meant to run through over and over again in pursuit of better gear. And Eternal War, the PvP multiplayer component of Space Marine 2. Let's start by discussing the campaign, as it's what I came to Space Marine 2 for, so it's likely going to take up the lion's share of this video. Space Marine 2 picks up after the events of the first game, with Titus now living in exile and leading a rogue Death Watch squadron after being falsely accused of treason against his order. In Space Marine 2's opening minutes, we see Titus lead his Death Watch team through a remote jungle planet to investigate a distress beacon. However, on this planet, the squadron is quickly overwhelmed by Tyrannid forces, and Titus's entire team are picked off one by one, with Titus successfully finishing his mission, but also becoming mortally wounded in the process. However, as he lays bleeding out, a team of Ultramarines arrive to rescue him on the personal orders of the Ultramarine Chapter Master, who claims Titus's innocence has been proven. Titus is then put through a special procedure to heal his wounds, with this procedure having an added side effect of making him far stronger than he ever was before. Titus is then reinstated in his role within the Ultramarines, allowed to rejoin his old chapter, and put in charge of a new squadron consisting of 2 other Space Marines, Chiron and Gadriel, who aren't necessarily happy to be working under Titus, forcing Titus to try and regain the trust of his fellow Marines, who are still wary of Titus due to the past accusations levelled against him. While the setup for Space Marine 2 is simple enough, the storyline can be oddly impenetrable at times due to Space Marine 2's constant use of Warhammer jargon. If, like me, you're not overly familiar with the Warhammer universe, a lot of this lingo is going to fly straight over your head, as Space Marine 2 isn't going to hold your hand at all. This is evidently a story designed by Warhammer fans for Warhammer fans, but losing track of some of the nuances is something that to an extent you just have to accept when you're playing a game set in such a grand universe that's existed for decades if you're not already invested in it. If you're an outsider like myself, one of the first things you'll notice about Warhammer is the strange religious cult overtones of the Space Marines, with all the Marines calling each other brother, and their constant praise of the Emperor. Get used to hearing every possible variant of phrases like "Hail the Emperor" and "the Emperor protects." It immediately makes you question the Space Marines' motivations, and if they're just blindly following a potentially dangerous dogma, because that's what they've been told to do. And you're right to be somewhat suspicious of the Space Marines, as they're not your archetypical sci-fi heroes. They're far more morally grey. They're arguably morally dubious space fascists. While I can't tell you the intricacies of the Warhammer universe, something I can tell you based on my experience with the first two Space Marine games is that this is a vast, bleak, and wholly unique universe that stands out in the never-ending ocean of sci-fi universes in the gaming space. This is a truly dark world filled with twisted lore tidbits. Go ahead and look at the cherubs, the cybernetically enhanced baby-like monstrosities that are enslaved to provide support to the Space Marines. Utterly horrifying. While the greater universe of Warhammer seems interesting, I can't say I was ever particularly invested in the story or characters of Space Marine 2. The story is very surface level and uninspired, with most of the characters feeling very one-note. It's a game filled with walking stereotypes, like Sakana, who's just the cookie-cutter military commander barking orders at her subordinates. And most of the Marines seem like meatheads. But once again, this isn't a story made for me as someone with no pre-existing investment in the Warhammer universe, so your mileage may vary if you're deeply entrenched in the lore of the tabletop game. And to give credit where it's due, while I was far from enamoured with what was happening in them, I was constantly awestruck by how clean and gorgeous Space Marine 2's pre-rendered cutscenes are, though they do make the rough animation found in the in-engine cutscenes stand out all the more. It's clear that Saber is hoping to continue with this franchise, as Space Marine 2's ending does set up another sequel, and I dare say the odds of a third Space Marine game are looking mighty high, seeing as Space Marine 2 sold 4.5 million copies in just over a month, so I don't think it'll be another 13-year wait between sequels this time. While the story never managed to get its hooks into me and pull me deeper into the Warhammer universe, Space Marine 2's gameplay immediately had me invested. Like the first Space Marine game, Space Marine 2 blends third-person shooting with hack-and-slash melee combat, and it plays incredibly well. Space Marine 2's melee weapons have the weightiness you want them to, and the guns feel nice and punchy thanks to Space Marine 2's snappy controls and excellent use of the adaptive triggers, meaning popping Tyrannid heads has never felt better. Blasting away at enemies and then instantly switching to melee combat when enemies get in range, stringing together combos that can bring any foe to their knees, is endlessly satisfying. As is the parry mechanic that allows Titus to deflect blows and even catch leaping enemies in midair before slamming them into the ground or tearing them apart with his bare hands. Titus fully channels his inner Kratos in these kills. To that point, Space Marine 2 is incredibly gory. Titus's firearms shred enemies to pieces, and melee weapons eviscerate opponents, turning them into clouds of viscera. There's also plenty of gruesome finishing animations when you press R3 while standing over a downed enemy, with all this carnage leaving Titus walking across levels soaked head to toe in blood like the Bloodborne Hunter. Space Marine 2's varied assortment of weapons gives its blood-drenched fights plenty of variety. Be it bolt rifles, machine guns, pistols, snipers, or flamethrowers, there's a firearm for every occasion in Space Marine 2. You'll need to tailor your weapon loadout for the encounter at hand and your preferred playstyle. Take the melee weapons for example. The hammer is a behemoth of a weapon that pulverises everything in its wake, but it's also quite slow, leaving you vulnerable if you time your attack poorly. Whereas the combat knife deals less damage, but is also very fast, allowing you to quickly land a few swipes before rolling out of the way of danger. Or maybe you're looking for a happy medium, in which case you'll want to use a chainsword, which is the most balanced weapon, offering a good blend of speed and damage. Even taking its drawbacks into account, once I got access to the hammer, I rarely used any other melee weapon again. This surprised me, as I'm usually not drawn to big heavy weapons, but when you charge up the hammer and bring it crashing to the ground, sending enemies flying in every direction, it just feels incredible. I also want to quickly give Saber a shout out for their excellent use of the DualSense features. As I mentioned before, the adaptive triggers add some extra oomph to the gunplay, and I love that the haptic feedback lets you feel the thud of Titus's footsteps in your hands whenever you run. It conveys how big and heavy Titus is, and he should feel that way. With his cartoonishly big suit of power armour, the guy is practically a walking tank. It's borderline comical when you see him standing next to ordinary humans. While there are comparisons to be made to Gears of War with Space Marine, I mean, the dodge roll feels ripped right out of Gears, it ultimately does play quite differently for one big reason. Gears of War is a cover-based shooter. You're almost always glued to a wall during combat encounters in Gears, whereas Space Marine doesn't have any form of cover system, meaning you have no choice but to play aggressively. There's even a Bloodborne-style recovery mechanic, where you'll get a bit of health back if you immediately land a counter hit after an enemy attacks you, further incentivizing you to always stay on the offensive. Space Marine 2's combat is further elevated whenever you're given access to the full suite of traversal abilities granted by Titus's jump pack, which allows you to dash out of the way of danger, launch enemies upwards with a vicious slash, and hover in the air while raining down bullets on the enemies below, before crashing down to the ground with a colossal ground pound to take out any remaining straddlers. One major feature of Space Marine 2 that makes it stand out over other third-person shooters is its excellent use of Saber's swarm tech. We previously saw this tech in their World War Z game. This tech allows for hordes of thousands of Tyranids to appear on screen at once, moving like liquid as they barrel towards you, climbing walls by piling atop one another like the zombies in World War Z. And throwing a grenade into one of these hordes and seeing Tyranids ragdolling everywhere really highlights how impressive Space Marine 2's physics are. Ironically, this makes this AA shooter one of the more next-gen feeling games of the PS5 Series X generation due to how much is happening on screen at any given time, though this does occasionally cause Space Marine 2 to drop frames. Not to a significant enough degree to hamper the experience, but the frame rate issues are prominent enough to be noticeable. While it's not a punishing experience, Space Marine 2 is by no means an easy game. Because there are endless swarms of enemies rushing you, it's crucial that you stay on the move to ensure you don't get surrounded or backed into a corner. The bosses can also be surprisingly challenging. They're bullet sponges who deal massive damage, so they'll kick your teeth in a matter of seconds if you don't keep your distance. My only real complaint about Space Marine 2's combat is its lack of enemy variety early on. Throughout the first half of Space Marine 2's campaign, you're fighting a lot of the same Tyranid goons over and over again, with these fights only being broken up with the occasional mini-boss like a Hellbrute or a Carnifex, which is apparently a giant Tyranid monster in the Warhammer universe, and not just a great deathcore band. Thankfully, the enemy variety picks up a lot in the back half of the game, which spices up combat encounters before they can ever become too stale. I also want to give Space Marine 2 credit for its immaculate pacing. This is the kind of shooter campaign we don't get enough of anymore. So many games now are overly bloated with padding, and as someone who was a teenager during the PS3 360 generation, when this kind of 8 to 10 hour campaign dominated the market, I felt somewhat nostalgic playing Space Marine 2. Space Marine 2 is on the longer end of that spectrum, clocking in at about 10 hours, which is pretty much exactly what I'm looking for in a shooter. It's enough time to fully flesh out your ideas without overstaying your welcome. While I won't say much about them, as most of them come during the tail end of Space Marine 2, I do want to give Saber props for the cinematic set pieces they pulled off in Space Marine 2. There are some crazy over-the-top sequences here that offer a massive sense of scale, and Saber certainly saved the best for last, as the final few hours of Space Marine 2 are a relentless rollercoaster ride in the best way possible. You'll always be in a squad of 3 when playing Space Marine 2's campaign and operations missions. Your 2 squad mates can be controlled by other players in online co-op, or by the AI. AI companions can be hit or miss. Often they just feel like dead weight, but Space Marine's AI squad mates are beyond competent. I'd go as far as to say Space Marine 2 offers some of the most intelligent friendly AI I've ever seen. They hold their own in combat, flank enemies for you, they'll run in to perform finishes on downed opponents, and they will always prioritise reviving you when you get downed. I never once died because they kept me waiting for too long, which is pretty damn impressive. Once you've made your way through the campaign, it's time to explore Space Marine 2's other offerings, Operations and Eternal War. At a glance, Operations looks a lot like the campaign. You're still in a squad of 3, making your way through linear levels, but unlike the campaign mode, which has no real sense of character progression, Operations mode is all about customizing your Space Marine, outfitting them with different gear and cosmetics. In Operations mode, you'll choose from 6 classes of Space Marine: Tactical, Assault, Vanguard, Bulwark, Sniper, and Heavy. Each of these classes has unique class abilities, weapons, and mobility gear. So while the Assault class has the jump pack that you're familiar with from the campaign, the Vanguard instead has a grappling hook to get around. You take your chosen Marine through a series of self-contained missions, levelling up your Marine and their gear, while also unlocking new equipment, all in the pursuit of running these missions over and over again more efficiently. I played through all of these missions once, and they're surprisingly high quality. These are good missions. While they're not quite as fun to play through as the campaign missions due to the repetitive objectives, with a lot of Operations missions requiring you to simply stand your ground and hold off waves of enemies, they're still thoroughly enjoyable thanks to Space Marine 2's impeccable combat. The problem is that the idea of running through these levels over and over again doesn't hold much appeal to me. Not because they lack replay value per se, but because I'm not the type of person who wants to run the same missions again and again. It's why, while I enjoy playing through the campaigns of games like Destiny, I also tend to bounce off of their endgames fairly quickly. For me, there are just too many amazing games out there to play to justify playing the same content over and over again. Though it is nice that Space Marine 2 includes a mode like this for players who put a lot of weight on the replay value of the games they buy. Finally, we have to talk about the Eternal War mode, Space Marine 2's online PvP component. I had no idea what to expect out of Eternal War. I've compared Space Marine 2 to the shooters of the PS3 360 generation, and during that generation, it was common to get a great game with a clumsily tacked on multiplayer mode that wasn't very good to try and prevent you from immediately trading the game back in. I think of games like Spec Ops The Line, BioShock 2, and Dead Space 2 that had sloppy multiplayer modes that really shouldn't have been included, as they're not what anybody is coming to those games for. And I feared that Space Marine 2's multiplayer would fall into this category, but Space Marine 2's multiplayer is far better than I had expected. The assortment of maps found in Endless War are very well designed, filled with vantage points and choke points that allow for fun, intense showdowns. Space Marine 2's online suite has a standard lineup of modes. Annihilation, which is your standard team deathmatch mode, where the first team to reach 50 kills wins. Capture and Control, your King of the Hill equivalent, where teams compete to capture and hold down different control points across the map. And finally, Seize Ground, the domination stand-in, where two competing teams clash over control of a moving objective. While the multiplayer is fun, with only 3 modes to choose from, the PvP component of Space Marine 2 is undeniably a little anemic, especially when compared to other shooters like Call of Duty and Overwatch, which limits Eternal War's long-term appeal. When it comes to visuals, Space Marine 2 is a little inconsistent. To a degree, this is understandable. When you have something as taxing as the swarm system in your game that allows for thousands of enemies to be on screen at once, you have to make compromises to get the game running. So while things look decent from afar, when you look at textures and character models up close, Space Marine 2 isn't the prettiest looking game. But with that being said, there is one area where Space Marine 2's visuals sing, and that's with its environmental design. The environmental artists have gone above and beyond here to create beautiful, original, and highly varied environments. There are grand cities with architecture spiralling into the sky, dense forests, and epic castles. While Space Marine 2 is a completely linear game, the sprawling buildings in the distance fill you with a sense of awe that makes the cities you fight through feel huge, giving this world a gigantic sense of scale. I also love the way this universe has drawn inspiration from and mashed together the visual identities of different cultures, with many buildings having an almost Roman Catholic look, and some enemies' armour having a more Egyptian-influenced design. While I find the setting of the 40k universe breathtaking, one thing I'm not big on is the character design. Obviously, taste in art styles is entirely subjective, but I hate the way Space Marine's characters look, and I think it's one of the things that prevents me from fully connecting with this world. Which I realise may sound silly, but games are a visual medium, and their art direction is very important to me. I just find everything about these characters off-putting, from the blocky bodies with weird proportions, to the oddly square faces. It's clear that this is an intentional design choice, but it's just not one that clicks with me. The final thing I need to note is that I did encounter a handful of technical annoyances with Space Marine 2. As I mentioned earlier, the frame rate can be a tad inconsistent, with some noticeable frame drops during particularly taxing portions of the campaign. I had a strange recurring glitch, where when returning from missions, the spaceship model would already be docked on the ground, so when the ship landing animation played, a second ship would land on top of the one already on the landing zone, which was undeniably immersion breaking, and there are quite a few invisible walls strewn throughout Space Marine 2's levels. I didn't expect invisible walls to make such a noticeable comeback in 2024, but at least Saber put more effort into masking the invisible walls in Space Marine 2 than Game Science did with Wukong. Space Marine 2 offers exactly what you want out of a sequel. Saber has zoned in on what worked in the first game and expanded on those ideas, refined the rough edges of Space Marine 2's predecessor, and added plenty of new flourishes like the swarm system to make this sequel feel bigger and better than what came before it. Space Marine 2 offers wonderful environmental design, epic set pieces, and more than enough replayability for those seeking it. While its story might only resonate with 40k diehards, it nails the most important element of any shooter: game feel. Space Marine 2 plays phenomenally well, offering a uniquely satisfying blend of third-person shooting and hack-and-slash action, making Space Marine 2 a worthy pickup for anybody seeking a no-frills, masterfully paced throwback to the shooters of a bygone era. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, make sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can find countless other videos on my channel, including my review for Game of the Year winner at the Game Awards, Astrobot. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming reviews of The Plucky Squire, Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, and Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster. Till next time, be well guys.